So something I wanted to talk a little bit about today is virtues. Being a virtuous person, because as someone who is so passionate about philosophy, moral philosophy is something that I'm so intrigued by. So for those that don't know, moral philosophy is basically the philosophy of morals, the philosophy of good and bad. What is it to be a good person? What is it to be a bad person? What is goodness? Moral philosophy is such a sort of open subject. There's so many different sort of ideas and concepts when it comes to moral philosophy. And I'm also intrigued in the philosophy of well-being. So philosophy of well-being is basically, what is it to live a good life, to live a well life, I should say. What is well-being? How can we live well? Because there's so many different ideas about how we should be living our life, and I love that conversation. And today we're going to be talking about moral philosophy, and moral philosophy can kind of link with the philosophy of well-being. It opens up the question of, does living a moral and good life lead to a sort of happy life? And that's a sort of question that maybe we can kind of explore in a future video. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about virtue ethics, because this is a sort of theory which is good for people who are starting to learn about philosophy, or people who've known a little bit about philosophy but don't really know much about virtue ethics. So virtue ethics focuses on virtues, hence the name. It focuses on virtues and how we can be the most virtuous person that we can possibly be. But I suppose the question is, what is a virtue? And how can we be virtuous? There is an unlimited amount of different virtues that we can kind of aim towards, but I'm going to just list a couple just to kind of give you an idea of some virtues which are out there. So some examples would be being curious, being courageous, being generous, ambitious, modest, being honest, being charitable and humble. That's just a small handful of different examples of virtues. Virtues are basically qualities with a high moral standard. So basically a good person would be ultimately a virtuous person. A good person would have lots of virtues. Whereas with vices are basically the opposite of virtue. So anything good, think of the opposite, and that's ultimately probably the vice. But a bad person would be a person full of vices and lives a very viceful life. I don't know if viceful is a word, I'm just going to assume that it is. So the reason I wanted to talk about virtue ethics is just because as a theory, I find it so interesting. It's something that I think a lot about when I'm questioning myself, whether I am a good person. I kind of question my virtues, and virtue ethics makes you question yourself in a good way. It forces you to kind of question, am I a virtuous person? Which virtues do I have? Which vices do I have? How could I be a more virtuous person? And obviously this isn't a sort of concrete idea. It's not like, oh, if I do X, Y, and Z, then I'll be a virtuous person. And Aristotle kind of makes clear that how difficult being a virtuous person is. He has this concept called the golden mean, and the golden mean is like the perfect virtue that we should be aiming towards. It's the centerpiece, it's what we should be aiming to be and do. So an example of a golden mean would be courage, to be generous. Another example would be being truthful and honest. These are the golden means, virtues, perfect virtues. That is the golden mean. And Aristotle kind of suggests that this is what we should be aiming towards. We should be aiming towards these golden means, because that's basically what would make us a good person. However, Aristotle kind of recognises how difficult it is to kind of meet this middle ground. It's so easy to either be too generous or not generous enough. If you're too generous, you can kind of be a bit extravagant and a little bit too much. Should we be aiming towards that? No. Okay, fine, I won't be as generous. Well, then you risk the sort of possibility of being stingy and not giving enough. And Aristotle kind of makes clear on how easy it is to not reach this middle ground, because as human beings, maybe we aren't actually that virtuous. And this is something I question a lot. Are human beings as virtuous as we probably think that we are? Aristotle kind of suggests that no, like realistically we make mistakes, we tell lies, we aren't as generous as we should be. We can be cowards at points. And that's why I love virtue ethics. It's very raw, it's very honest. It makes you kind of realise, yeah, you do make mistakes, and that's okay. Hopefully I'll be able to put on the screen somewhere where I can show the golden mean, and then on each side I can show the different vices, which is a potentially what you could end up reaching if you either give too much or not enough when trying to meet that sort of golden mean, to meet that middle ground. You know, he's not saying if you do all of these things, if you do X, Y, and Z, you are officially a good person. He's not saying that. But rather what he's saying is we should be aiming towards these virtues. We're human, we mess up. You're not always going to be a completely virtuous person. You're going to lie. You're going to be too generous or not generous enough at points. He recognises this, and this is his point. He's kind of making clear the fact that you are going to mess up because we are human beings. But what's important, according to Aristotle, is the fact that you're trying to reach these virtues, that you're trying to be the most virtuous person you can possibly be. When I was making my notes, I wrote down the only way to know if you're doing the right thing is if you are trying to do the right thing. And I think that's my favourite thing about virtue ethics. It's the fact that as long as you're trying to be a good person, that's what matters. There's a sort of analogy for whether you're kind of trying to be a good person or not. And the idea is that, so you have a target, and the centre of the target, the bullseye, that is the golden mean. That is the perfect virtue that we should be aiming towards. But shooting an arrow towards that centre isn't easy. If anything, it's really difficult to get that centre bit. Realistically, if you shoot an arrow, it's probably going to go all over the target, right on the edge, maybe almost at the target, but not quite. Sometimes you might shoot an arrow and it might go in the opposite direction of the target. This analogy is making clear on how difficult it is to meet that virtue. So according to Aristotle, it's not hitting the target that's the most important part. The important part is that you're shooting that arrow. You're shooting that arrow to try and reach that target, and you will mess up. But sometimes you will reach that centerpiece. Sometimes you will reach a sort of perfect balance of virtue and vice, and that is what is most important to Aristotle. I could talk about virtue ethics all day happily because I think it's such an amazing theory. And naturally, virtue ethics has its faults. Virtue ethics isn't a perfect theory. You know, it isn't always easy to follow these virtues. He doesn't really talk about certain situations where you can kind of not follow virtue ethics, and this theory does have problems. However, generally speaking, I think it's a good rule to kind of follow. Use this to kind of question yourself. Use this to question, are you a virtuous person? Are you courageous? Are you generous? Are you generous enough? Or are you not generous enough? Are you being stingy or are you being extravagant? When it comes to honesty, are you being secretive and maybe not being as truthful as you should be? Or maybe you being too honest? I mean, that's a whole other question. That's a whole other video that we can talk about. Is it possible to be too honest? That's a whole other subject. But allow yourself to question, are you a virtuous person? Could you be more virtuous? But I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've just enjoyed kind of talking about virtue ethics because it's something I'm super passionate about, and I think it's really useful. Obviously, I'm a very flawed character, like any other human being, and I'm trying to figure out how can I be the most virtuous person? So that's why I wanted to talk about it today, to allow you to question yourself, to ask yourself, how virtuous are you as a person? But thank you so much for watching this video, and I will hopefully see you soon. Thank you so much.